Well, you're usually carrying more in your car than you realize you are. And I learned that recently. A few Saturdays ago, I was driving to West Lafayette. It was it was a day when there was a big game in town, football game. And, they had cut off, they had closed all the turn lanes along Sagamore there, to turn left. And I just thought, well, that's weird. I wonder what they're doing. So I just went up. There were not many cars there at the intersection. And I took a left turn. Of course, it's a big deal. I mean, the arrow still worked, told me to turn. So I went, took the turn. Little did I know it, there was an Indiana State Trooper right behind me. So he turned on his lights. And of course I thought, I must be an important guest in town. And he comes up, he's got the crew cut, he's clean shaven. He asked me for my license and my registration. So I opened my glove box there, and I got my license easily enough, but there are a lot of papers in the glove box. There are receipts from maintenance. There are numerous years of registration for cars I still don't own anymore. There was proof of insurance from several years, companies that I no longer give money to. And so I even had some mail in there from 2023, and finally I found it, and the state trooper he went back, and he was very kind to write me a warning, because he was looking out for my safety, of course. And he had the suggestion that I might go through those papers sometimes, just figure out what's there. Yeah. Well, that's what's happening in our lives a whole lot. And that is that we are often carrying things we don't appreciate the value that they have. In fact, it reminds me of a story that's found in Exodus 3 and 4. Moses, he's a shepherd. He's living out in the wilderness. He sees a bush burning, and out of the burning bush, as he approaches it, he realizes it's not burning up the bush. He hears the voice of God, and God tells him, hey, go to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go. So the children of Israel were going to be led out of bondage and slavery in Egypt. And Moses does what many of us would do. He starts making excuses about why he can't do this, why he's not the right person. And along the way, it goes into chapter 4, he's still making excuses. He says, I'm going to show up, and they're going to say that it's not true, that you didn't meet me, you didn't tell me to do this. What then? And God says to him, Exodus 4:2, what's that in your hand? What's that in your hand? And of course, he's just got a shepherd staff. It's ordinary wood. But when he surrenders it, it parts seas. It brought water from a rock. It defeated Pharaoh's magicians. Now Moses could have said, Lord, it's just a stick. And some of us, we look at our gifts like that. Lord, what I have to give you, it's not much. Or it's so precious to me, I need to use it in other ways. I can't imagine that I have the time or the talent or the resources that matter to you. Look to somebody else. But in God's hands, it's just a stick. It becomes miracles, wonders, signs from God. The verse we're going to look at today, it's about seeds and harvest. And it's about how the seeds you plant end up bringing something back to you. And The thing is, I really think God is asking you and me the same question today that he asked Moses. And that is, what is in our hands? What is it that God has given us to give to him? Because right now in our church, I don't know if you know this, God is at work. I called just like 2 weeks worth of connection cards. I call everybody who visits for the first time yesterday, 2 weeks worth. I called about 20 numbers. People I talked to said, yeah, I came to church. No, nobody invited me, but I came to church because I'm looking for God. I need to find him. You know what? That's not just a random thought a person has. God is doing something in people's lives all around us. And he's gonna get it done right here in our midst. And whenever God is at work changing people's lives in kind of an accelerated way, I'd say right now, it becomes incumbent on everyone who comes to church, who calls this church, your family, who you're committed to Jesus. It becomes incumbent on all of us to plant the seeds that are already in our hands into God's field. Look how Galatians says it. Those are the seeds that might be in your hand. You got more in your hands than you realize. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows, and whoever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. And whoever sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. I'm asking you today, and I think God is asking you, what's in your hand? What do you have to give to God? You've got time, you've got talents, you've got relationships, you've got a family, you've got treasures, you've got passions, you've got energy. You may have a place that you live. There's all kinds of things that have been put into your hand that you could give to God and let him turn into something more than what it is today. Now, today I'm going to tell you a number of stories that I hope will illustrate just how powerfully God can use the seeds that we would plant in the local church in particular to change people's lives in forever kinds of ways. Because listen to me, the seed that you plant today determines the story that you'll tell tomorrow. Because there are stories in people's lives that are unfolding, and how it is that you become engaged in reaching other people or making a difference in other people's lives, it has everything to do with whether or not you're part of some things that really, really matter. Because my guess is all of us think about what we plant the seeds of our lives into, our time, our talent, our treasure, our energy, our passions, and I would guess that we could find a number of things that we feel like don't have a very great return about them. I'm talking to you today about things that return in a perpetual, unending way. And the first person I want to tell you about is my wife, Tracy. That's her in a little baby dress. That's her mom, Patty. She was living in a suburb of San Diego. Tracy, maybe in this picture, she's, 1. But when she was 2 years old, Tracy's parents divorced. This brought a crisis into their lives, certainly a financial crisis. They divorced because her dad was unfaithful in a number of instances, and And this marriage just fell apart, but this really put the family in a crisis because Tracy's mom, she's working at home, just taking care of the kids. She wasn't working. They really felt like they were going to lose everything, and this really for a number of years put their lives in a lurch. They felt such pressure, and during this time, of course, Tracy's mom and her sister and Tracy, they felt the pain of that broken home and broken marriage. And even though her mom, she was like raised around the church, she really returned to church at this point, once the marriage blew up. Because she knew that she needed God. She was turning there to find it. But Tracy would tell you that it wasn't like a sermon on a particular day. There was a healthy local church there in their community in Chula Vista, California. People who were willing to serve in the kids' ministry, in the nursery, to help it be healthy. Tracy remembers a couple in the church who took an interest in their little family and took them on as part of their family and took them to meals and offered babysitting and were there in very practical ways for this mom and her two little girls. There was a community of God-loving women in this church who were in small groups where they were having Bible studies, and they invited Tracy's mom into these Bible studies where she was really discovering God in a whole new way. Tracy tells me that there were people who were willing to give up their comfort, their preferred seat, their place in their small parking lot at the church to make space for Tracy's mom and Tracy and her sister. And the longer she went there, she developed these associations with church. I've heard from other people that they have, where she felt that the church was like a safe place. That she was realizing this was a family to her. That when she went to church, she felt safe and loved and whole in a way that had really been jeopardized and made vulnerable by what happened in the divorce. And she writes to me, Tracy says these words. She says, I've been secure in my faith through trials and adventures, and have been able to help many others find God because the local church was strong and healthy, so that my family and I could find God many years ago. When Tracy was 5 years old, she was in that little church, sitting with her mom. Her mom, she had such little money when they sit in church. She'd take a little stick of dentine gum, break it in 3 pieces, one for each person in the family, because she just didn't have much. But on this particular Sunday, there was a visiting speaker guest, and he was singing, as part of his thing. I'm not going to be singing to you today, just in case you wondered. And he got to the end of the service. Tracy's 5 years old. She's sitting halfway back in the church, and the guest speaker invited people to come, if they want to receive Jesus, to get out of their seat and come to the front. And Tracy, without asking her mom, she just got out of her seat and walked down the front. And she gave her life to Jesus. And that really, these experiences shaped her life forever. And what I'm saying to you is, God is at work in people's lives all around you. God's at work bringing people here in all the settings where we have ministry throughout the week. And God is looking for us to become interested in what he's doing, because there are really big issues on the line that may not appear that way to us right now. 6 years after Tracy's mom's divorce went through, she ended up getting remarried. In fact, it was the children's pastor's brother. His name's Michael. He was in our first service today. He lives here in Lafayette. Michael was a Christian. He hadn't been married before. He didn't have other children or anything. But he took on Patty because he loved her and their 2 kids. This is Tracy at her high school graduation. And Tracy can't say enough about the example of love, of stability that this man brought to her life. The way he loved her mom. But he wouldn't have become the person he was unless there had been a church where the people were engaged at reaching others for Christ. When it comes to planting seed, you've got to recognize your life, the stuff that God has put in your hands, the seed there, it can only become something more when you let it go. So many of us, we're nervous to hold on to what we have. We think we don't have time to do something else in our lives. Or we think that we don't have money that could matter or make a difference in God's work or in God's interests. Or we think that our talents are so small, they really couldn't make a difference for anybody. When we talk about planting seed here, we're not just talking about like natural efforts. We're talking about the fact that when we plant the seeds of our lives into God's field, God becomes engaged with that. God has infinite possibilities, infinite power, infinite wisdom. And we can imagine that we can plant seed and it's going to be like forgotten. Or like we can give of a lot of ourselves and it really won't ultimately make a difference. It will be lost somehow. And I can remember feeling that. I remember when my family and I were first becoming missionaries. And I was selling my house and I was selling my cars. I was selling most of our furniture. My oldest brother, he was not really a believer. He came along and bought both my cars because he could get them for a song and a prayer. And I'll never forget, he looked at me and he said, you're selling your house? You're selling your furniture? You're selling your cars? He's like, are you sure you know what you're doing? And I said, no. But I do know God. And I know that I can trust Him. Fast forward several years. I remember moving to a bedroom community of Amsterdam. We were going to be starting a church. And I was starting a church in this community that was like filled with a lot of famous people in that country. I didn't know who any of them were. And as I walked out my door one night, I ran into Teo, my neighbor from across the street who's in his late 60s. He asked me if he could go on a walk with me. I said, sure. So he lights up his cigarette. We start walking along. And he says, now tell me again, what are you doing here? I said, Teo, I'm here to start, we're here to start a church for the significant international community that lives right around here. This church will be in English. Of course, Dutch people will be welcome. And he just kind of laughed. And he just said, well, neighbor, I think you ought to go home. Nobody here is interested in Christianity anymore in this country. You're wasting your time. nobody's going to buy what you're selling. And we walked along, and I began to wonder, what I was doing there. Just what was I doing, risking what I had for this? If you fast forward again just a few years, Teo was driving me to the airport. I was getting ready to leave the country, come to America for a while, and then return to Paris to start another church. And Teo was driving me to the airport, and he said, "Now, what are you going to do there again?" I said, "Yeah, I'm going to go and visit churches around America and give a report of what had happened, and explain to them what I'm going to do next." He said, "Oh." You see, in those few years since the first time I met Teo, his wife, and the 3 grown daughters, and their husbands, and all of their grandchildren came to Jesus through that church. They were all baptized except his wife. She had been baptized because she was already a Christian. And he says, when you get to those churches, will you please tell them thank you for sending you here and your family here? He said, my life and the lives of my family are changed forever because of it. I'm telling you these stories partly because I want you to understand, we have a lot of missionaries through here. We give you a lot of opportunities to give to missions. And maybe you think, what in the world is going on? How in the world is that strategic? I tell you what, when we plant seeds in God's field, He turns it into a whole lot more. And it will only emerge into something more when you let it go. Jesus, he tells us that unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. The way that something becomes more is for you to let go of it. And when you let go of what you have, when you start investing your life, the stuff that's in your hands, into God's purposes, God's program, God's direction, really, really crazy things start to happen. I remember when we were opening that church in the Netherlands, been open a few months. I mentioned that in that town, there were a lot of well-known people, because it's the capital of all the media interests in that country. So all the television, music, movies, radio stations, everything's produced there. And there was a girl walking by the front of our church. Her name's Charlie. She was 16 at the time. She's a pediatrician today in Amsterdam. She has dark black hair. She's got light, really pale skin. And she was walking by, and turns out, her dad is kind of like Dick Clark or like Ryan Seacrest in America. He's got a top 40 show on the radio every week. People know his name. And she was walking by, and she heard the music from the church, and so she walked in through the doors. And she came into the service, and at the conclusion of that service, she gave her life to Jesus. Amazing. And I remember talking to Charlie and saying, Charlie, what is it that brought you here? She said, I was walking by, and I was feeling such anxiety and depression. Like there's a shadow over me. And feeling so lonely. Think about that. Somebody you think has everything, struggling like that. And she said, I walked by the church and I heard that music. She said, I don't know how to describe it, but it's like joy. Just passed right into my heart. And I thought, I got to go in there and find out what that is. Friends, the people around you, they're looking for God. Will you invite them? Will you share with them what your experience has been with them? Will you put aside the fact that you might feel silly, or you might feel like they won't listen, for the fact that if you'll plant a seed, God will do something more with it? You know, God turns small seeds into supernatural harvests. This lady, this is a picture we got last Sunday. Maybe that's why I've been thinking about this so much. Because I keep seeing ways that the seeds we planted turn into something more, turn into a supernatural kind of harvest. This lady here, she sent a text to Tracy last week. She speaks in women's conferences all over the world, and she wrote Tracy, and she said, you know, I was in this women's conference in North Carolina, and I met this woman. Her name is Nancy. She said, you know, when you were starting that church over there in the Netherlands 20 years ago, you had a Bible study that she came to. And she told me today that's where she really gave her life to Jesus. That's what changed her life. She said today, she's been living in North Carolina now for several years, and she and her children, they're actively engaged in the church, and she wanted you to know you made a difference. You know what? Tracy's planting seed. She cannot remember who this person is. It's because God takes something maybe you feel like it's insignificant. Maybe you can't you can't figure out what God could do with it. And He makes a significant difference out of it. You know, when I think about supernatural reaping, I think about one day when I was going to the central station there in Amsterdam. There's a lot of trains coming in and out of there, 900 a day. And I was coming to the end of the day. I just finished teaching some courses at the Free University, and I was on my way home. And as I got on the train, in a particular car, in a train that had dozens of cars, and sat down, I noticed that a woman, a few minutes after I got on the train, walked onto the train. She's blonde. I don't know who she is. And she looks at me, and she just walks right back to me. And she sits down right next to me and looks at me. And I'm just like, what's going on here? I don't know who this is. And she says, you're my pastor. I was like, what? She said, yeah, you started a church in my town. And I've been coming. She said, but today. And then she told me a story. That earlier that day, she's an investment banker in one of the largest banks in Europe. That day she got a call. She's from the UK. She got a call from her divorce attorney, who was explaining to her that she was going to lose her family estate that she owned through a trust to the man who was divorcing her because the way some negotiations had gone. She said she became so discouraged, she just closed all the blinds to the glass walls around her office and anything looking into her office, and she just sat at her desk and sobbed. And she said she determined right there that she was going to go on the last flight from Amsterdam to London. She was going to go to her family estate that night, and she was going to end her life. She said, but then, she said, I stepped on a train. And of all the hundreds of trains, all the multiplied thousands of train cars that come in and out of here every day, you're on the train car I stepped into. And she said, I just knew it immediately when I saw you. I knew I knew it was true. There really is a God. That gospel that you've been preaching, it's really true for me. She said, I'm not going to go home and end my life. I'm going to live the rest of my life in a way that matters. Because I know God's there. He made me. He loves me. Friends, these aren't things that just happen to me. These are the kinds of things that will happen to anyone who will plant their lives in a way that's consistent and generous into God's interests. Now, this could mean a whole lot of different things for you. Maybe it means that you do start Growth Track. You do find a place to serve. You do figure out how you're wired and what your gifts are. Maybe it means that you're feeling actually a call from God to actually go into ministry. Maybe that's something that God is calling you to. Then there are some other steps you can take, but I want you to hear me. God's looking for all his people, not just to plant seeds, but to discover the wonder of what happens when you plant those seeds into what God cares about. Don't hold the seed. Plant the future. I don't know what you invest your life in. Maybe it's your kids' sports. Maybe it's football games this afternoon. Maybe it's having the most beautiful yard and house that you can possibly imagine and work toward. Oh, God has made you for so much more. He's put seed in your hands that can turn into something worth so much more. But in order to see that future come about, you've got to open up your hands and let go of the seed. Maybe it means changing your priorities. Maybe it means changing what it is you've been spending your time and your talent and your treasure and your passions on. Cast your bread upon the waters, for after many days, you will find it again. I used to think that meant like taking some Wonder Bread apart and throwing it on the pond. It's actually an ancient expression, cast your bread upon the waters, of taking seed and putting it on marshland, on wetlands. That's what it means to cast your bread upon the waters. It'll come back to you. It'll come back to you in a way that's multiplied. I'm going to ask for the musicians to come into place right now. I just want to tell you one last story. I didn't get to tell it in the first gathering. But Tracy and I, when we graduated from college, we moved to Wisconsin. We were married, and I was a pastor. Tracy was an elementary education teacher. And there in our church, we were there about 7 years. There in our church, like a couple hundred people. There was a little girl. Her name was Becky Borkenhagen. She's one of like 7 or 8 kids. Borkenhagen, that's a mouthful. And she was kind of bored in children's church, so she started to invite her best friend from school, who lived just a couple hundred yards from our church. And so her friend's name was Tanya, and Tanya would walk down to the church. Tanya's parents, they really weren't very interested in church or God, but they let her go. And she came every Sunday, and she was just captivated learning the stories of the Bible, hearing about God, learning to pray to him, learning to worship. She just thought it was amazing. And I remember she came into 7th grade and she came into the youth group and she had such a vibrant faith and she was ready to be baptized. I got to baptize her when she was in junior high. Then a few years we moved on. Didn't really think I'd ever see her again. But when she was like a junior in high school, she invited her boyfriend to come to church. His name's Mark. And Mark, he was amazed also by everything that was happening there at the church. It's all news to him. He didn't know any of it. Jesus, God, the Bible, everything's there. He didn't know any of it. But he gave his life to Christ late in high school. He was baptized. Then Mark and Tanya, eventually they got married soon thereafter. And when I went back to that church, I was on my way to Paris. I went back to that church to visit one Sunday morning. They were great supporters. And I noticed there was Tanya with her husband, Mark. And they were listening really intensely. And after the service, they walked up to me and they said, hey, we were listening and we both felt like the Holy Spirit said to us, we need to leave our jobs and we need to go with you to plant that church for 2 years. Can you help us figure out how to do that? I said, sure. And these people, they're not ministers. That's not their background. They're like, God's telling us to do this. I said, what's your dream to do there? They said, we dream to lead children's ministry there. We want to help lead the children's ministry where you're going. I said, okay. So they raised the money, and I ended up getting there before them, and we helped Mark and Tanya and their 2 kids, little kids, get settled. And we were getting ready to open the church several months later on Easter Sunday. On Saturday, for Easter Sunday, my second son, Xander, he was almost 9. And he came to me and he said, I've been thinking very seriously about some things. He still tells me that, but he was 8 at the time. And I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, he's like, yeah. He says, I just, as I thought about it, I just don't think that I believe in Jesus at all. I don't think that he's risen from the dead, and I just don't know about all this church stuff. He says, I will go to church tomorrow, out of respect for you and Mom. And I thought, well, that's good. You're 8 years old. You're determining some good things here. And he says, but I don't believe it. So the next day we opened the church and hundreds of people showed up. It was awesome. And we were having dinner at our house after the service. And Xander pulled me aside in this corner, wanted me to kneel down. He thought nobody could hear him, but it's not a very big house, He says, Dad, he says, I got to tell you something. I said, what? He said, I believe in Jesus. I know that Jesus is risen from the dead. I know that it's real. I asked Jesus into my heart today. I said, that's wonderful. How did that happen, or why did that happen? He said, Mark and Tanya. They told the story of the resurrection. And I just knew for the first time in my life, it's not just a dream I'm believing. God's there. It's really true. I don't want to imagine how or what would have come from it if Mark and Tanya hadn't planted the seeds that they did. You got stuff in your hand to let go of. You got stuff in your hand that can make a difference for forever for others. So why don't you listen in hard to what God is saying and do it? Will you stand with me? Lord, we're looking to you right now. And I recognize, God, as we're turning our hearts to you, I recognize there are probably some people listening right now who have not planted themselves in Jesus, but they want to. As your heads are bowed and your eyes are closed, if this morning you recognize you need to give your life to Christ, you need to commit your life to Him, or you need to recommit your life to Him, you just slip up your hand. I'd like to pray with you today. Anybody at all? Anybody at all? Yeah, there's somebody. There's a few people. Yeah, quite a number of hands going up. You can go ahead and put it down. And just pray like this right where you are. Just say these words out loud, yourself to God, and just say, Father, I believe in Jesus. He died for my sins. He rose from the dead. Forgive my sins. Give me a new life. I give you my life. In Jesus' name, amen.